There is a room you have never been invited into. You know it exists. You have felt its presence at the edge of every professional encounter, every dinner where someone mentioned a name that opened a door you couldn't see, every conversation that ended just before the real one began. You are talented. You are intelligent. You work harder than most of the people inside that room, and still, the invitation never comes. Machiavelli understood why. 500 years before LinkedIn, before networking events with name tags and lukewarm wine, before the performance culture of modern ambition, he mapped the invisible architecture of access, and his conclusion was brutal, precise, and liberating. You are not being rejected because of what you lack. You are being rejected because of what you radiate. This is not about confidence in the motivational sense. It is not about smiling wider or speaking louder or memorizing the right handshake. What I am going to show you is something far older and far more dangerous, the quiet signal that separates those who circulate power from those who observe it from outside. By the end of this, you will understand why 90% of ambitious people are permanently locked out, not by circumstance, but by frequency, and you will understand exactly how to change yours. Stay with me, because what comes next is not comfortable, and discomfort, as you will learn, is precisely where the door begins to open. Think carefully about the last time you walked into a room of accomplished people and tried to impress them. Maybe you referenced your credentials. Maybe you over-explained your work, your vision, your results. Maybe you were charming, enthusiastic, perhaps even brilliant, and still something invisible repelled the exchange. The conversation stayed surface. The follow-up never came. You left with business cards and nothing else. Here is what was actually happening beneath the surface. Machiavelli wrote that men in general judge more by their eyes than by their hands, because seeing is available to everyone, but feeling what you truly are is available to very few. Elite circles operate on perception first and reality second. But this is not about illusion, it is about economy. The signal that grants access is not a performance, it is the conspicuous absence of one. When you try to impress, you signal need, and need, no matter how elegantly disguised, is the one frequency that closed circles are evolutionarily wired to detect and repel. Think about what the act of impressing actually communicates beneath the words. I require your validation to feel complete. I am auditioning for a role in your world. I am not yet certain I belong here. These are not character flaws, they are structural errors, and elite circles are not cruel for sensing them, they are simply efficient. They have built their world on the conservation of attention, and attention given to someone who is still proving themselves is attention poorly spent. Robert Greene observed that in the game of power, few errors are more fatal than appearing too eager. Eagerness announces a gap between where you are and where you want to be, and gaps in the psychology of high-status environments become targets. Ask yourself something, not in the spirit of self-criticism, but in the spirit of surgical honesty. How much of your behavior in professional and social settings is driven by the desire to close a perceived gap between you and the people in the room? How often do you speak not to contribute, but to be seen contributing? This is the invisible wall, and most people spend their entire careers throwing themselves against it without ever understanding what it is made of. Now here is what the architects of elite access actually understand, and what the 90% consistently miss. The wall is not made of credentials. It is not made of connections or capital or charisma. It is made of illegibility. The most powerful people in any room are the ones you cannot fully read, and because you cannot read them, you cannot help but watch them. Machiavelli advised the prince to cultivate an aura, not of superiority, but of controlled mystery, to reveal enough to be interesting, and to withhold enough to be indispensable. Carl Jung mapped this dynamic from the psychological interior. The persona, the mask we wear for the world, becomes dangerous not when it hides us, but when it becomes us. The people who move through elite circles with ease have not mastered their persona, they have transcended the need for one. They do not perform belonging, they simply occupy space as though it was already theirs. And here is the brutal truth that most people are not ready to hear. You have been over-explaining yourself because you were taught that clarity earns access, that if you simply show people who you are and what you are capable of, they will naturally recognize your value and open the door. This belief is not wrong because it is naive. It is wrong because it misunderstands what elite circles are actually selecting for. They are not selecting for the most impressive candidate. They are selecting for the most self-contained one. The person who does not need the room is the person the room wants. Take a moment here. Think about the people in your life or your field who seem to move through professional and social ecosystems with a magnetic, almost frictionless ease. What do they have in common? I would argue it is not pedigree, though some have it. It is not even results, though most have them. It is a specific quality of self-possession, a sense that they are here not to be accepted. They are here because they chose to be. That distinction changes everything about how they occupy a room, how they speak, how they listen, how long they wait before responding. The question I want you to sit with before we continue is this: in which rooms of your life are you still auditioning? Here is what the exclusion you have felt was never telling you. It was never telling you that you lack merit. It was never telling you that the circle is unbreachable or that the system is designed to keep you out forever. What it was telling you, if you were willing to listen with the precision it deserves, is that you had not yet learned the most counterintuitive lesson of power. The people who gain entry are not the ones who fight the hardest to get in. They are the ones who become so complete within themselves that entry becomes a formality. Machiavelli wrote that it is better to be feared than loved, but he also understood something more nuanced beneath that famous line. What he really meant is that dependence on love, on approval, on being liked, on being welcomed, is the surest path to powerlessness. Because love is conditional, it can be withdrawn, and a man whose position depends on another's goodwill is forever at that goodwill's mercy. The Machiavellian move is not to make yourself feared, it is to make yourself unnecessary to validate. This is the transformation the 1% have made that the 90% have not. They stopped seeking admission and started building something worth seeking admission to. And that shift, that precise psychological reorientation, is what changes the signal you emit without you ever having to consciously perform it. Think about Nassim Taleb's concept of skin in the game. The people inside elite circles have it. They have built something, risked something, lost something, and rebuilt. They carry the weight of their own decisions in their posture, in the economy of their words, in the fact that they do not need to explain themselves because their track record speaks without a voice. When you walk into a room still trying to convince people, you signal that the track record does not yet exist, or worse, that you do not yet trust the one that does. So now we arrive at the mechanics, not the philosophy alone, but the architecture of behavior, because understanding a principle without embodying it is the most expensive form of self-deception. The quiet signal begins with the economy of self-disclosure. Most people in professional and social contexts disclose too much too soon. They explain their past, their ambitions, their current projects, their challenges, not because they are insecure necessarily, but because they have been conditioned to believe that sharing builds trust. And it does, but only when the other person has earned access to that sharing. Elite circles are not built on openness, they are built on earned access to openness. When you offer everything to everyone, you signal that nothing about you is rare. And rarity, as Machiavelli knew, is the foundation of all perceived value. Practice deliberate withholding, not coldness, precision. Answer questions with questions. Offer observations rather than confessions. Let curiosity about you accumulate before you satisfy it. The person who speaks last and least in a high-stakes room is almost always the one everyone wants to speak to afterward. The second element is composed observation. When you enter a room as a performer, your energy moves outward, toward the audience, toward the validation, toward the reaction you were scanning for. When you enter as an observer, your energy moves inward, toward comprehension, toward pattern recognition, toward the silent accumulation of information that will make everything you eventually say worth hearing. Machiavelli studied rooms before he spoke in them. He watched the currents of self-interest, the micro-alliances, the people who moved like they owned the space, and the people who moved like they were borrowing it. You must develop this discipline. Arrive early, sit in silence before conversations begin. Let your stillness become conspicuous. Stillness in a room of performers is the loudest thing in the room. The third element, and perhaps the most surgical, is the art of the precise question. Elite circles do not grant access to those who bring answers. They grant access to those who ask questions that reveal the asker. The quality of your question signals the quality of your thinking. When someone asks a surface question, they reveal a surface mind. When someone asks a question that reframes the entire conversation, that introduces a dimension no one else had considered, they become the most interesting person in the room, not because of what they know, but because of how they see. Machiavelli himself was not powerful because he had armies. He was powerful because his ability to read situations and ask the questions rulers were afraid to ask made him indispensable. Make yourself necessary through the precision of your perception. One question that genuinely illuminates something the room has been circling without naming is worth more than an hour of impressive answers. Now we arrive at the final and most powerful insight, the one that inverts everything you have been taught about access, about ambition, about the architecture of belonging. The door was never locked. It was waiting for you to stop knocking. Elite circles do not require you to force entry. They require you to become the kind of person for whom entry is a natural consequence of who you are, not a goal you are pursuing. Machiavelli understood that the prince who was constantly fighting to maintain power was the prince who had already begun to lose it. True power is self-sustaining. True access is self-generating. When you have built something real, when you have stopped auditing your behavior in social spaces for signs of approval, when you have developed the internal architecture of someone who genuinely does not need the room begins to need you. This is the paradox the 90% cannot solve because they cannot stop trying long enough to see it. They optimize for entry when they should be optimizing for themselves. They study the room when they should be building something the room cannot ignore. They knock louder when they should be going home and making something so undeniably excellent that the knock becomes redundant. The quiet signal is not a technique you apply. It is a state you inhabit. It is what remains when you strip away the performance, the need for validation, the chronic scanning for approval. It is the frequency of the person who has done the internal work, who has grieved the version of themselves that needed to be chosen and built the version that chooses. That frequency is rare, and in a world of performers, the person who is not performing is always the most compelling presence in the room. So here is the question I want to leave you with, and I want you to answer it with the kind of honesty that most people reserve only for 3 a.m. when no one is watching. Where in your life are you still performing for an audience that has not yet earned the right to your performance? Where are you spending energy broadcasting a signal that was never going to open the door you actually want to walk through? Because the moment you can answer those questions clearly, the moment you can identify the rooms where you are still auditioning and choose to redirect that energy toward building, is the moment the signal changes. Not because you decided to project something different, because you became something different. The circle you want does not need to be broken into, it needs to be outgrown. Build until the doors open on their own, and when they do, you will notice something Machiavelli promised and history has confirmed. You will not even need to walk through them, because by then, you will have already built your own.